Welcome to the Kick Sugar Coach podcast. Join me each week as I interview experts who will share the science of sugar, sugar addiction, and different approaches to recovery. We hope to empower you with the information and inspiration, insights, and strategies you need to break up with sugar and fall in love with healthy whole foods so you can prevent and reverse chronic disease, lose weight, boost your mood and energy. Feel free to go to my website for details on my coaching programs and to access free resources, kicksugarcoach.com. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this very special interview. I am here today with Dr. J Kaplan, who's from my home country, Canada, actually. And let me just read you her bio. She's a Professor Emeritus at the Cumming School of Medicine, or was a Professor Emeritus in the Cumming School of Medicine at the University of Calgary. She has published widely on the contribution of nutrition and mental health. Her efforts to include nutrition knowledge in the care of people with mental health challenges has earned her a variety of awards. The Dr. Rogers Prize, selected as one of 150 Canadian difference makers in mental health, and the top 7 over 70 in Calgary. Her book, The Better Brain, was written with Professor Julia Rucklidge. Her goal is to influence the way mental health treatment is understood and delivered. Her book, The Better Brain, is gobsmackingly brilliant. And if you do not own a copy, you need to go and make sure you get on Amazon right now. You have the option of, it's right in the back there. You can get it in hard copy. It just came out in paperback. And you can also listen to it on Audible. And that's how I read the book myself. I listened to it. And it is really, really exciting. And anybody who's sort of been interested in this space, like the connection between brain health and nutrition and mental health, is going to be in for a real treat, because she's bringing the nitty-gritty on the ground science that we've been looking for to validate the role of nutrition, and equally the role of micronutrients in supporting our brain health and mental health. So welcome, Dr. Kaplan.
Thanks so much for having me here, Florence. I want to just correct one really small thing for any academics who might be listening. I'm still a Professor Emeritus. I will be as long as I live. I used to be a professor. So what that says is that I am happily retired from the usual active research career that I had, but still doing the things like talking to people like you and your audience. And that's what I want to do.
Oh, thank you for that clarification. And I appreciate it. Please never, ever, ever not be a Professor Emeritus. We need your work. I want you to be top 9 over 90 in Calgary.
Oh, you're the first one to say that.
Oh, I think as more and more people read your book, they're like, oh, long live Bonnie, because this book is really hopeful and it's empowering and it's fascinating. So I'm excited to get into your research and your knowledge today. So why don't you start by telling us, how did you get interested? So you were were you a family physician? I know you're an MD.
No. I'm actually a PhD in basic kind of clinical research, experimental psychology. I have never been a clinician of any kind. I never treated people, but I encountered lots of people, of course, who were in our studies. So that, in that sense, it was clinical research.
Got it. Thank you. And how did you become interested in the topic of nutrition and mental health?
Well, I received a really good background education in the biological basis of human behavior, which is what always attracted me. I always knew from the get-go I was not going to be a clinical psychologist, or as I sometimes say, I never helped people, I just studied them. But I was very fortunate to study an area that helps a lot of people. So when I was going through my training, both in experimental psychology, psychophysiology, and then I did my graduate training in physiological psychology, and then a postdoc in neuroscience. And then I worked in a neurology department. So I was always interested in what was happening in the brain that would account for behavior. And it's not, by the way, it's an opportunity to tell your audience that I fully recognize there are a lot of psychosocial issues that affect behavior. And, it's important for people to know I don't see everything in terms of the biology of the brain, but it is the foundation, in my opinion. And if you're interested in that foundation and the biological basis of human behavior, then you bump up against the metabolism, which is dependent upon micronutrients. And the whole world should be taught that, but we're not. We're taught, I don't think the teaching has changed much since I was a child, which is that you have to eat well to build strong bones and muscles. Now, I have nothing against bones, having good bones and muscles, but nobody ever taught us that primarily when we're eating, we're feeding our brains because it's the greediest organ that we have. No one ever taught us what those nutrients did in the brain. And it's so easy to teach. I've taught it down to grade 6. It's so easy to teach. So that's what I'm passionate about now, is improving education and mental health treatment based on the knowledge of what nutrients are doing for our brain health. That's what led me there. I hope that was clear.
So I'm really intrigued that you started with psychology and then you moved into neuroscience, and now you're making the connection between nutrition and mental health. And it's my understanding for people who actually go and study psychology today, that if they go and they get their master's and they're heading out into the world to be psychologists, they're not allowed to talk about nutrition, and they're not allowed to talk about vitamins, right? Like, why is that, Bonnie?
No,
why
no,
are they hide?
That's a myth, but I'm not surprised that you would be expressing it, because probably 99% of psychologists would tell you the same thing, and it's not correct. So actually, my colleagues, Julia Rucklidge at University of Canterbury and Jenny Johnstone at Oregon Health and Sciences, and I last year published an article specifically for clinicians in a major American Psychological Association journal. And I'm happy to send that to anyone who wants to ask me for it, any clinician. It's explaining why it's in their wheelhouse, so to speak. It's within their scope of practice, and here's what they should know for clinical psychologists. But I also often cite an article that was in the major American Psychological Association journal. It's called The American Psychologist, and it's kind of the house organ of the APA. And I don't remember the year. The author is named Walsh, and I think it was around 2004 or something like that. I can send it to anyone who wants to contact me on my website, and we'll talk about my website maybe later. But that article really was all about the lifestyle variables which are in the scope of practice for psychologists, and nutrition's right up there at the top. Educating people about nutrition is absolutely essential if you're wanting to help them improve their brain health, but also exercise, meditation, relaxation. It's all in the same category, the lifestyle variables. So it is within their scope of practice, but a lot of them don't know.
They really don't, Bonnie. I did not know that. That is so encouraging. Are they allowed to talk about vitamins and minerals and supplements as well? Is that within their scope?
Anybody can talk about anything. Your next door neighbor can advise you on, hey, I think you probably should take a look at, your vitamin, I don't know, D or something, anyone can. Now, really what you're talking about is prescribing, but that doesn't pertain to improving a better diet. So no, there is no concern there.
Wonderful. What is the connection between, and when was there a moment in your career where the light bulb went on and you thought, oh my goodness, the connection between nutrition and mental health and brain health? Like, was there like a pivot point?
There were about 4 of them.
Okay.
So I don't want to bore you. I'll just talk about the 4th one, but I'll tell you that the first 3, I kept trying to study nutrition in my career. And first of all, when I was, going through training in my first jobs, it was, it made you look very fringy, flaky. I mean, even 20 years ago, there were physicians here at University of Calgary who thought I was studying magic. I mean, this is vitamins and minerals. They were trained the way I was, Florence. We were all taught that vitamins and minerals were of trivial importance when it came to treating mental health. They weren't that important in the brain. The absolute opposite is truth. I mean, they are the foundation of our brains. That's how we build our cells. It's how our cells function. And we teach a lot of that in chapter 2 at the level of the general public. And they are responsible for providing optimal function in our brain. They're foundational. They're the foundation of our resilience. Everyone's so concerned about resilience now for good reason because of the pandemic and everything. But very few articles say, well, wait, start out by making sure that your brain is healthy. And that's where they should be starting. I'm not saying that the other things aren't important. There are a lot of other things we should do to maximize our resilience, but that's the really important first step.
Absolutely. And tell us about that fourth pivot.
Oh, the fourth pivot. Thank you. I thought you'd forget it. So I had really given up studying nutrition, partly because it was so difficult, but partly also because I kept running into fanatics. And I'm not a fanatic person myself. I really don't trust people who become fanatically oriented. You know, like someone once said, I believe in nutrition. And I said, well, on a good day, I believe in God. But, nutrition is not something to believe in. It's not a matter of faith. It's what we're made of. So I got totally turned off by having to deal with fanatics like that. And everybody has an opinion about nutrition because we all eat, right? And I remember telling my husband I think it was probably in the early 1990s, saying, I will never study nutrition again. I've had it. And then in 1990, don't ever say never, right? So never say never. So in about 1996, I was approached by a colleague in Southern Alberta, University of Lethbridge, who thought that I should, because I had been interested in nutrition. He knew I was probably the only psychologist or research psychologist in Canada interested in nutrition. And there were two families in Southern Alberta who had approached him because they had been helping people by giving them lots of vitamins and minerals. And at first I refused to meet with them. That part is not in the book, but the rest of the story is in the introduction to the book if anyone wants to read it. Because those two men did not have the blinders on that scientists tended to have. They were two family men. They each had their own career. They had no intention of ever becoming natural health product producers or anything like that. They just knew that they had seen people improve tremendously, especially the children in one family, by giving them, instead of one nutrient at a time. Those are the blinders that our scientists and clinicians have. They want to find one nutrient or maybe two nutrients or three, but God forbid you should ever give people what the brain needs, right? These two men, one of them particularly, knew about the breadth of micronutrients needed in the brain. And so that's how they had proceeded, based on what they knew the brain needs, not the scientific method that says you should change one variable at a time. The so-called scientific method turned out to be a very large stumbling block as we began to do our research. And I often tell the story of the very first poster presentation that I did in the year 2000. Because, of course, after meeting these two guys, that was my pivot point, right? But I'll just end with this one anecdote. It was at the Canadian Psychiatric Association meeting, and a psychiatrist who was very interested in this open label case series that we presented, in which we subsequently published in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry. But he was very interested, and we had the list of the roughly 30 micronutrients that were in the formula that we were studying. And he ran his finger down that list. And as he did so, he said, which is the important one? And I was gobsmacked because he was looking for a magic bullet. And there isn't any. If you know anything about, and anybody reading our chapter 2 and looking at the diagram will get this right away. After you read that chapter and you get the complexity of human metabolism, you will understand that there will never be a single ingredient that completely optimizes your brain health. Now, I know that you have several nutrients that you have seen particular benefit from in circumscribed kinds of symptoms, and I'm not negating that, right? But for optimal brain health, our brain has to get all of them. If not in pill form, then preferably, of course, in our diet. So that was a real pivot point for me, getting involved in that.
My God. And you know what? It was a similar pivot point for me, because you and I both being, Albertans, and
Yeah.
I grew up 45 minutes from the farm where these two men founded these micronutrient companies. I grew up in Lethbridge. And then I
Mm.
was in Edmonton, and I was friends. I chummed around a bit with Autumn Stringham way back. I haven't talked to her in years. And she started to awaken me to the fact that brain health and mental health and nutrition and are so tied, and that some certain broad spectrum supplements were showing promise of helping us to feel better, think better, sleep better, everything better. And it was so exciting. I remember getting this fever of, wow, this is so cool. Because I was born and raised on junk food. By the time I hit my 20s, I was terribly depressed. I was a classic university student. If it wasn't pizza, it was pop. It was white bread, cereal, junk, right? Like, I didn't eat nutritiously, and I was not mentally well. I had a good life, but I would have depression and I would have migraines. And so when she came along to start to connect those dots for me, it was like this explosion of hope and excitement, because I thought there is a connection between food and mood, despite the fact that I've been going to doctors and they kept saying there's no connection. There's no connection.
Because they
Right.
were taught that way.
Yes.
That's the problem. They were taught that way.
And part of it is, Bonnie, Dr. Kaplan, is that
No,
there,
Bonnie.
there wasn't science. To be fair, some of those individuals, they're looking for it. And why your work is so great is because you're doing it. You're bringing the science to the science community that needs to see it, to open up their minds and start to get excited about it in the ways that some of us just got excited right off the hop, because we weren't going to wait for the science. We experimented with our own bodies, and we knew that we could feel the effects of better nutrition and microsupplements. So let's move on from there. So you started to work with these two companies, and then what happened with your career?
Well, I started to work with two men.
Yes.
Who later formed a company. And
Right.
then I think it was 2011, there was a business separation between the two partners. And so then what is it you want to know?
Well,
then what?
where did it go from there? So you got connected to these two men, and you're like, oh, this is interesting.
Yeah. So from the beginning, I realized that no one would believe our data if any of the researchers were affiliated with the company. So I want your audience to know that in spite of the terrible lies out on the internet back then, I've never been financially connected to them. They've never funded any of my studies. And that's true also for the group in New Zealand. My co-author, Julia Rucklidge, is there, and she has funded her work independently, as well as the latest multi-center trial that came out of Oregon Health and Science University, Dr. Jenny Johnstone, and University of Lethbridge, Dr. Brenda Leung was the second site, and the third site was Ohio State University. And so one of the things, if I can digress just a moment, you'll get me back on track. One of my two goals for retirement was to raise money to support research, because even at the highest level at NIH in the States, they still will only fund studies on one or two nutrients at a time, and they reject broad spectrum treatment research. So these people need to get their studies funded, and if they don't, then they leave the field. And we do not have a surplus of scientists yet. We are constantly looking for people to do more research related to nutrition and mental health. Anyway, that's gone very well. As of, I set up two charitable funds so donors could get tax receipts. And I set up a fund in the US and one in Canada. And as of October, so about 4 or 5 months ago, 6 months ago, we passed the $1 million mark, which I never dreamt we would reach. Now that's in Canadian dollars. If you converted it all to US, it would be under $1 million, but it's all distributed. It's supporting research in New Zealand, in the United States, both East and West Coast, multiple centers, and a little bit in Canada. And so we're always looking for more research money, more people who want to tax receipt and are willing to support that, so people can contact me. Now, that was a digression. Put me back on track, Florence.
It's a beautiful digression, because you know what it tells me? I recall you telling me before this interview that you would hope to raise maybe 50,000 and you raised $1 million. And doesn't that just tell you that the world is ready for this? There's so many people excited and passionate about getting this information studied and funded and out into the public so that it can help people. So it's just, I love that digression. So let's go back to what is the science starting to tell us about the connection between nutrition and mental health and brain health?
So I'll make this brief because obviously that's the whole body of the book. Right? We go through correlational data, prospective longitudinal studies, and those are very important because that means that the people were selected for having no mental health problems. Their dietary pattern was characterized, and then you see if you can predict who's going to develop depression or some other mental health problem. And there are a few studies that show that you can, which is very powerful. And then there's treatment studies, and some of the treatment studies are whole diet, and there are now 4 independent studies showing that you can take a group of people who are depressed and teach them how to eat a whole foods kind of diet, and their depression gets better. And all of them are randomized trials with comparison groups. And then the last category really is the one that Julia Rucklidge and I have both been very involved in, and she still is, even though I'm not conducting studies anymore. And that is, we sometimes call our work proof of principle, Florence, because we really don't think everybody in the world should go on capsules of micronutrients. But all of us have seen cases where people get better after taking broad spectrum micronutrients, and they have an aha moment and say, oh my gosh, my mental health is affected by nutrition. I better clean up my diet. So sometimes it's a little kick in the pants to figure it out. So in that final category, though, we review the whole world literature. And again, at a level for the general public, we don't give lots of numbers and data and boring stuff. We try to draw out general lessons. And the most consistent findings come from the 2 Alberta companies and those 2 formulas. And now they're going to, one of the companies has developed a sub company, and there are going to be more versions. We wish there were 10 or 15 of them. There should be lots of them. So there are about 50 peer-reviewed studies using micronutrients in pill form. And from these Alberta companies. And if I step back and say, what is it helpful for? Or as somebody once said to me, does this help ingrown toenails too? It seems to help everything. And the answer is nothing about toenails, but they all are improving brain health. And so lots of symptoms get better. But what we're finding across all of our studies is that there are certain symptoms which are we call them transdiagnostic because you see them in depression, you see them in ADHD, you see them in lots of different mental disorders, and they all relate to mood regulation. And so if I wanted to give a single message to your audience about, other things improve too. Energy improves, focusing your attention, all these other things. But if they have a problem with mood regulation, meaning keeping their mood calm and stable, not irritable, no meltdowns in children, no explosive rage, then they need to look at their diet. And if they can't solve that problem by improving their dietary intake, they are really good candidates for trying one of the broad spectrum micronutrient formulas. So I hope that was a simple enough condensed answer. And if you want more details and some fascinating, we have all kinds of case studies and case reports and anecdotes and stories about earthquakes and floods and everything and mass shooting effects, resilience. All of that's in our book, as you know.
I do know, yes. And I think that any individual because my audience tends to be individuals that are struggling with addiction, in particular sugar, food addiction, we are not getting adequate nutrition. So we're very likely to have, plus there's addiction issues, which means that we might have come into the world maybe deficient, stressed. We need more nutrition, and because we're hooked into junk food, we're getting inadequate nutrition on top of deficiencies. And for many, many of us, we know that depression and fatigue and brain fog, like this is our world. So we're eager and hungry for hope that there's ways of being able to repair our brains and to feel happy and good and bright and sleep well and all those good things that every human wants for themselves. And so for those individuals that might be struggling to clean up their diet because they keep relapsing or whatever, this is such a powerful way, an intervention that can help them to feel better and then start to clean up their diet, right? And I know we're at the early stages of doing research around the impact of the potential role of micronutrients in supporting addiction recovery. But anecdotally, there are individuals that are taking supplements, cleaning up their diet, doing all the other things that make us whole human beings and healthy, and are noticing such a profound difference. So it's really cool that with the earthquakes and the floods, individuals that were taking these supplements were just reporting, I'm less stressed. So tell us a bit more about one of those studies that suggest that the stress resilience is more robust when people are adequately nourished.
Okay, so what we have is a series of studies that Julia and I never intended to get involved with. But she was in the middle of some of her early work. Her first publication on nutrition and mental health was in 2009. Well, 2010, there was a massive, totally shocking, unexpected earthquake in her town, Christchurch, New Zealand. And she was in the middle of clinical trials with people with ADHD, both, I think, children and adults, or maybe that was just the adult phase. At any rate, and a lot of them at the time of the earthquake, just by chance, were not taking any nutrients because they weren't in that phase of the study. And other people were in that phase and they were taking one of the Alberta formulas. And so she had the good sense to compare the two groups. She had roughly equal numbers in each of those two groups. And she asked the question, was there a greater resilience in one group versus the other? And there was no question. The people who were taking the micronutrients were much more resilient, less stressed, less anxious than the group that were not taking any. But that, even though that was a very powerful study, it was not a randomized study. It just happened that she had the two groups. So New Zealand was nice enough to give her the opportunity to do a randomized trial, because after 5 months with 8,000 aftershocks, which you and I would call earthquakes, in a very, very stressed population, there was a second, even more massive earthquake in February of 2011. So from September 2010 to February 2011, in that 5 months, she, was trying to do other kinds of research. And then this major earthquake, this one was shallower. It destroyed a third of downtown. It killed a couple of hundred people. It was devastating to the psyche of a relatively close-knit small town. And so she tried to do a randomized trial. Now and she did do it. And this was no longer people who were in a clinical trial because of a mental disorder. It was the general population. Okay. And she replicated the results. I mean, some people got the real supplements, some got placebo. She did a couple different studies, consistent. And then in one group, she followed them up a year later. No question, the people who were taking micronutrients were more resilient, less anxious, less stressed. And then we had our flood in southern Alberta. So she called me and said, Bonnie, you have to go tell the mayor to educate people about taking nutrients to improve their resilience, because this is a really big event. But it was one event, not 5 months with 8,000 events. And I knew our mayor wouldn't pay attention to me. So we decided to do a study. So we did a study of these people after this one event. And I never thought we would replicate the earthquake studies because it was such a different scenario. But, it was exactly the same. in 4 to 6 weeks, the people who were randomized to get one of the formulas, the micronutrient formulas, were so much better in terms, and we used the same measure, depression, anxiety, and stress, than the group that had not been, that they had gotten, well, we had 2 comparison groups. Okay, let's leave it at that for now. At any rate, and then I'm going to tell you one sad footnote, okay? You remember the Fort McMurray fires?
Mhm.
And they were in, I'm getting my years mixed up now, 2009, no, earlier than 2019, 2016 maybe, somewhere a couple years later. So I thought, okay, now we've got the earthquakes, we've got local data from the Southern Alberta flood, and we had the 90,000 people displaced from their homes from Fort McMurray because of the terrible forest fires. So let's educate them this time. If nothing else, one of our comparison groups was B complex, and in a non-clinical group, just general population, that really improves resilience. So I went through the mayor's office, the emergency team, the Alberta Health Services, they sent me to psychiatry, dietitians. They wouldn't have any of it. And then the next year, our province published the data on the increase in mental health problems for depression and mood problems as a result of the Fort Mac fires. So it's very frustrating. We could have prevented a lot of that.
It's so heartbreaking. It really is a sad footnote. And it's why I'm so passionate to give you a platform, to plug your book, to get this information out, because it's a cost-effective, easy, almost anybody more or less could probably find some supplements that they can afford. And maybe governments, if they want to save money, can even get on board and make it available, right? Or something. But if we work together to improve the nutritional status and to offer micronutrients where they're needed and more information about eating whole foods and just how much happier and healthier and more resilient we'd all be together. And I don't get the resistance, Bonnie. Why would a proven science-based option, intervention that might be really truly helpful to people be so blocked? What do you think is where's the breakdown there?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'm going to just point out that if I broke my leg and went to a hospital emergency care to get it set, I would assume that the treatment I got was evidence-based, based on the most recent and best information, because we live in a good province with a good healthcare system. Same thing if, God forbid, I had cancer or any rheumatoid arthritis, anything. I would assume that the treatment offered me was evidence-based, the best that we knew around the world. You cannot make that assumption in mental health. Psychiatry is not evidence-based. It is pharmaceutically based. And the evidence on pharmaceutical drugs is not arm's length the way our natural health product research is. It is, in fact, the opposite. It is funded by the pharmaceutical companies. And that's a very important distinction. It also makes a lot of money for the companies. There is no big money to be had by selling vitamins and minerals. You cannot, there is no useful way to patent the combinations or anything like that. So people tell me that if you want to understand why the nutrition research is not covered even in the media, and it isn't, follow the money. Where does the media get their money from? I don't know. It's very peculiar to me that every once in a while there's a whole spate of articles on how vitamins and minerals are dangerous, which is obscene given that I think it's over 10,000 Canadians die every year. I know it's over 150,000 Americans die every year, according to the latest figures, from proper use of medication, not improper use, proper use of medications. And I can tell you that in Canada, there's never been a reported death from a vitamin or a mineral since Health Canada started keeping the records in 1967. So who's paying for these crazy articles to scare the public away from micronutrients? I don't know.
Wow, fascinating. Right. And, that was one of the pieces that I think was quite a revelation in your book as well, is how how little good data there is that pharmaceuticals are even that effective, particularly in the long term, that maybe there's acute use and some evidence to suggest that it's helpful short term, but long term, the data is not great, is it?
Well, I try not to spend too much time running down medications because the older I get, the more I see that we need the pharmaceutical companies functioning, helping us. I mean, look at what's gone on with the pandemic. Yeah. And I also know people who've benefited from psychiatric medication, and I don't want to ignore that fact.
Yes.
And occasionally I've run into someone who's benefited a lot with no side effects. They're rare without, not to have side effects. But, and not everybody benefits from micronutrients, by the way. No study has found 100% response. So, we're complicated, but why shut out the information on vitamins and minerals? I don't know. In all the years that I have been aware of the nutrition literature, I have seen the national and international media pick up on one out of roughly, I would say, 100 studies. And that's this one trial from Australia that has a cute acronym, the SMILES trial, and is an important study. But why just that one? Not another study has been covered. And there's a real bias against micronutrients in pill form. Very biased.
And yet we're pill crazy. We love pills.
Yeah, not vitamins and minerals, they could kill you.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, to be fair, there's probably different grades. There's, that we're not always apples to apples, that not every product on the market's high quality or has the depth and breadth as you describe in your book, or, naturally sourced, some are synthetic. And so, yeah, there's complexities there too, isn't there?
There definitely is. But, all of this, you said this early in this interview, you said something about all of this being empowering. And I hope that your audience feels this. Our book is really food first. And we have a whole chapter on recipes, and it's preceded by information about, tips for purging your pantry. And, if you don't buy it, you don't eat it, and how to move into improving your diet. And so I think it's empowering. I think understanding this very basic concept of what vitamins and minerals do in brain metabolism, in enabling those metabolic pathways to work, that influences how people eat. They tell me this all the time. Now, when I put a bite of food in my mouth, I think about whether or not it's going to feed my brain. That's really, really empowering. And by the way, I'll toot our own horn a little bit on this. I get asked a lot of the time, Florence, why did we write a book on nutrition? There's so many books out there on nutrition. And I like to point out, first of all, the vast majority are on physical health, but there are a few on mental health, but they're basically just telling you what to eat and what not to eat. In fact, I say they're shaking their finger in front of our faces saying, eat this, eat that. Now, I happen to think that what they're saying is mostly accurate, but I don't think it changes behavior. Just telling people what to do, if it changed behavior, we wouldn't have more than half of our society, all of our society, more than half of their calorie intake being from ultra-processed chemicals. And it's getting worse. Every time the surveys come out, it's getting higher and higher. So we think that our book is the first one that has the ability to change human behavior by educating them as to what they are doing to their brains and how and why to improve their brain health.
Right. I love that. Yes. And I love that whole sort of food first, and, and then you've got other options too, to sort of support and supplement. And I also, one of the things that's interesting about your book is you say, don't complicate it. Just eat all whole foods. All whole foods are good. Just put them into good combinations, right? Just leave the ultra processed and processed foods, which is entirely the message of all the work that I do. Unhook from the junk, fall in love with healthy whole foods. And then know that there's actually potential micronutrient supplement support that can even help you again. So why would you say that there is this ever increasing there's rising rates of mental health issues. Like, why do they just keep rising?
Well, the mental health issues keep rising along with the increase in chemical intake. And that's one way to look at it. Now, correlation doesn't mean causation, and there's nothing more complicated than human behavior. But when people say to me, oh, people are just going to eat comfort food because we're living in such stressful times, I try to remind them that, like, my grandparents lived through World War I, World War II, the pandemic of 1918, the Holocaust, the Dust Bowl, the Depression. Come on, times now are not more stressful than that. So it's our resilience that has gone down. And what we need to teach people is don't turn to comfort food, turn to resilience food. And comfort food is generally stuff that doesn't have many vitamins and minerals. Resilience food would be feeding your brain, because that will give you the resilience. And by the way, the latest Canada food guide is, I think, right on target to fill half your plate with fruits and vegetables. I think that if people just knew about that more and tried to follow it more, they would have a healthier brain.
Right.
This is important, not just for mental health. You have to remember that I'm a senior, so I'm very aware of the role of these micronutrients for cognitive health and prevention of dementia. There's a growing amount of research on that. We cite a few studies in our book, but it's constantly coming out. People are showing that stop looking for drugs to prevent Alzheimer's. Just start eating right, and that's going to help you a lot.
Right. And I see in my own practice that individuals that come in, we can have 40 to 50 people in a group. We walk them through 6 months of addiction recovery coaching. We start them out by getting them on whole foods, right? We unhook from all processed foods, drinks, all of it. We get really just whole foods only. And then literally by 90 days, I start having people report, my doctor's taken me off this medication. I am no longer on metformin. I have reversed my diabetes. I am no longer depressed. It's just phenomenal. 90 days in, just eating whole foods. Now, it's easier said than done, which is why often its support is helpful, but it's that powerful. It's that powerful, isn't it?
Yeah, we are what we eat.
And it's so simple too. Maybe that's part of if there's an innocent reason for part of the resistance from putting your book on the front page of the New York Times, is because it just seems too simple and too easy. What? Just eat better? No, that can't solve all these complicated health and mental health problems I have. Like, that's just too easy.
Yeah, well, get us on the front page of the New York Times and we'll see who we convince. No, I'm being silly. The fact is that the book is selling pretty well. My goal in life is not to sell books. I mean, it's an important educational tool, but I really want to see mental health treatment change. And that was the most fun I had in writing the book with Julia Florence was chapter 12, our last chapter, which is our vision for the future. Because I think it's so doable. It's all a matter of education, and to get away from the idea that as soon as a person has a problem, you put them on medication. Medication should be the supplement. That's why I talk about nutrients, and I tend not to use the term supplements for nutrients. I think they should be first line treatment. And I'm kind of making that point by saying nutrients in pill form. So nutrients from whole food. And by the way, we have to improve agriculture and support the people who are trying to improve agriculture. We have half a chapter on the soil microbiome in the book for that reason. And so first, whole food, get rid of the ultra processed chemicals and toxins and clean yourself up that way. And then take nutrients in pill form if you still want to see if you gain more benefit. Everything else, exercise, social support, meditation, etc. And only then, if you still need to, medication should be a supplement.
Well put. Beautiful.
Now you know what chapter 12 says, basically.
Yes. And, I can imagine that there's people, because I was really depressed in my 20s. Like, I really ate terrible. And I was so feeling hopeless. Like I just didn't know. I kept thinking there's something really wrong with me. What is wrong with me? And so people who are depressed and struggling with mental health issues can feel like there's something wrong with them, as opposed to just something wrong, like their brain isn't adequately nurtured and nourished. So when you're freaked out by the idea that, oh my gosh, that seems really risky, Bonnie, for me to work with diet and potentially micronutrients to solve this really serious problem I have, because many of us have suicidal ideation, what reassurance can you bring us that these strategies that you're suggesting as the first line of defense can be as effective as pharmaceuticals?
No one has done a head-to-head comparison yet. You'd have to really answer your question scientifically. We would have to have someone able and funded, it's probably never going to happen, to do a direct head-to-head comparison where people are randomized to get micronutrients or medication as the first line treatment. And I don't think the drug companies would stand for that. But there are a couple of designs that I've floated and trying to find people to do studies on, but hasn't happened yet. But I think what you're raising is a really important point. It's very easy and healthy to improve your diet and try micronutrients first, and to talk about that in someone who is not currently taking psychiatric medication. Almost all but one of the studies on the broad spectrum formulas, all but one has been in people who are not on medication. And, they never tell people stop your meds to be in our study. That's unethical. And I would not want anyone in your audience to stop their medication to try micronutrients. That's not even the way it's done. Competent people who are trained in the use of these formulas do cross titrations, and you never stop the medications like that. What you do is you start the micronutrients, and when you see a signal that maybe they no longer need that much medication, then you can do some gradual reductions. But that cross titration is very important to learn. And people who don't learn it and just add the micronutrients, well, I know that there was a time when physicians would say in our province, take whatever vitamin and mineral you want, as long as you don't change your psychiatric medication, the stuff that I'm telling you to take. That shows incredible ignorance, because, it's not incredible, it's credible in ignorance. It again, reflection of their education. These are not stupid people, but they were taught that the vitamins and minerals would be of trivial impact on the brain. So the reality is that if you're taking vitamins and minerals that don't affect how you're reacting to your psych meds, then you're probably not taking very good vitamins and minerals for a very large dose. Because as your brain gets healthier from micronutrients, what used to be an appropriate therapeutic dose of a psych med should begin to feel like an overdose, right? It's just, that's what happens. So learning that interaction is very important.
Really, really good point. I'm really glad we went there. Can you I'm not sure everybody understands what cross titration.
Cross titration. Yeah, no, it's a very simple concept. Titrating means that you're adjusting a dose. So what you do is what they do is they start taking a small dose of the micronutrient formulas and gradually increase it. And when it's appropriate, they can start decreasing the medications. So as the micronutrients are going up, the medications are going down. So it's cross in that way.
Got it.
That makes sense?
It does make sense. Yeah. And I just happen to know, because I have some training in this area, that one of the tipping points where you start to figure out, okay, I think me and my doctor might need to start to lower the dose of my psychiatric medications or my pharmaceutical medications, is when I start having side effects. Mm-hmm. And it's so common for people to think, oh, these vitamins and minerals are making me worse. I have more anxiety. I have more depression, or have more like unwanted sleeplessness or something. And it's actually a really exciting sign, because those are the early warning signs that you're now over-medicated, and you can start to titrate down as you continue to keep nourishing the brain. Is that your understanding as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And you said it very well, actually, Florence. And I remember years ago when I first encountered this, And I realized I'll bet the general public doesn't understand that an overdose of a psychiatric medication can look like an underdose, in the sense that some of those overdose side effects can resemble psychiatric symptoms requiring more medication. And so a lot of psychiatrists, their immediate reaction is to raise the dose of the medication, which is counterproductive, shall I say.
Yeah. And that's, that I just want to stress that because that's a really cool point. So let's say you're on pharmaceuticals, SSRIs or whatever, and sorry about that. And the doctor knows it and is working with you, and you start these micronutrients, or you start eating better, and both, hopefully both. And all of a sudden your symptoms seem to be getting worse. And it's a sign typically like, oh, well, maybe you need more, maybe you need another one. And they add a second pharmaceutical and it just doesn't, so it might work for a little bit. It seems like it's helping a little bit. And then it stops, right? And it's just such a really huge revelation for people to think, oh, the exact same symptoms that put me on the medication can be the exact same symptoms when I have too much medication. And pretty important.
Yeah, I think a skilled clinician can often detect the difference between overdose symptoms and underdose symptoms or side effects, but sometimes I think it can be very confusing.
Yeah. And
I'm not a clinician. I haven't had to deal with that. Just so your audience knows that.
You were spared. Is there any final words you'd like to share with us today on the topic of nutrition and mental health?
Yeah, so I guess I want to make sure that my website is available to everybody. There are too many Bonnie Kaplans in the world, so you have to use my middle initial. So it's bonniejkaplan.com, and Kaplan is with a K. And on that website, you'll find lots of links to interviews like this, videos, lectures, one or two videos of children who benefited, who are their families discussing the kinds of symptoms that got better, and also recipes, tips for clinicians, but they're really tips for people anybody who's trying to change their diet, and also a way to contact me if you want to email me. That's on there. So I have someone who keeps it pretty up to date, although it doesn't have all my talks. We're always putting a selection up there. So if you want more. Oh, and one more thing. There's a 4-minute video on there that really explains the metabolic pathways in chapter 2 of the book. And I think a very simple form. So that's one of the videos that people might want to watch. And also the fundraising is on there if there are any potential donors who are listening.
Oh, I love that. Yes, absolutely. I hope you get another $1 million. Absolutely. We need this research. Thank you for your time, for your work. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Florence. Nice talking to you today.
Thanks for tuning in this week. If you would like more interviews, more information, and more inspiration on how to break up with sugar, go to my YouTube channel, Kick Sugar Coach, or my website, kicksugarcoach.com. See you next week.